So good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Friesen, and I'm the Director of Settlement Services for ISSofBC, and it gives me great pleasure to have you all here join us this evening for our inaugural event on Does Immigration Matter? I want to first acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's important for us as an immigrant serving agency to take the time to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory. As an agency that works with thousands of immigrants and refugees, we've been increasingly concerned about their lack of awareness and knowledge of Indigenous peoples of Canada. So over 10 years ago, we have begun various initiatives to help increase the awareness of Indigenous peoples to immigrants and refugees. And for us, if we look ahead now over the next 3 years and realizing that over 1 million immigrants and refugees will come to Canada, this is part of what we see as our responsibility, is helping in a small way to increase that awareness. For those of you that are connected to social media, we have a designated hashtag of Close Look 2019. What's that? Closer Look, sorry, 2019. Thank you. So here we are, an immigrant serving agency that has been working with immigrants and refugees in this province close to 50 years. We offer a variety of programs and services throughout primarily Metro Vancouver, the Fraser Valley, and a few other communities in British Columbia. For us, this public education series for us was trying to attempt to get us out of our own echo chamber, to challenge us around our work, to create a safe space, to have valuable dialogue in this environment of heated social media tribalism between one side and the other side. And how can we begin to have open discussions, safe open discussions? We don't agree with every policy and program that the government provides around immigration. We as an agency understand the tremendous dynamics and the complexity of immigration in this country. But this is our sort of our initial step of coming out of our box to help us better understand different aspects of immigration and its impact on our country. So we hope, as you join us, to learn, to challenge some of what we are doing, and to perhaps adjust some of the things that we're doing now around immigration to better support those immigrants and refugees that are restarting in this country. We're in the midst of a federal election, and so far, the public discourse has been fairly tame in regards to immigration. But we know with the public debate coming, and one of the federal parties already calling for lesser immigration, this is part and parcel of the environment that we work in. We're not saying it's right or wrong. Yes, of course, we have our own bias as immigrant serving agency. But we truly believe that the time has come that we have more open discussion and debate around various aspects of immigration, whether you're pro-immigration or against immigration. So this is our attempt to do that. We also wanted to, a special reach out, not only to those that are joining online, but here in the room. We intentionally also wanted to reach out to our neighbors. We've been in this facility now for 3 years. And as a way of opening up and better communicating and seeing firsthand some of what we do behind these walls, it is also a thank you to our neighbors who, from the very beginning, have welcomed us in this neighborhood in the work that we do. So I would now like to introduce our moderator this evening, Dr. Kathy Sherrill. She has worked for ISSofBC for 10 years and is currently the Associate Director of Settlement Services here at ISSofBC. She takes a lead role in program development and evaluation, contract negotiations and oversight, as well as quality assurance and standardization. Kathy holds a PhD in geography from the University of British Columbia and a Master's of Arts degree from SFU, with a specific emphasis on refugee resettlement in Canada. She's actively involved in research with refugees and is at present a co-investigator on 2 pan-Canadian multi-year refugee resettlement projects, as well as a lead on numerous internal research projects. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Kathy.
Good evening, and I just want to begin by echoing Chris's words of welcome and thanks for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to an evening of good discussion, of Douglas Todd sharing his words, and to be able to have some of those discussions on things that aren't always comfortable in a safe space. What I appreciate about Douglas's work is he's willing to ask the questions and to talk about both sides. Neither saying this is correct or this is wrong, but to have the conversation and provide an overview that's rounded and grounded. So over about the next 40 to 50 minutes, Douglas will speak, and then we've got about half an hour to 40 minutes for questions. Our keynote speaker today, Douglas Todd, is a multi-awarded journalist and author whose writings focus on migration, ethics, diversity, spirituality, and psychology. Writing mostly for the Vancouver Sun, for Postmedia News and Religions News service in Washington, D.C., Douglas has won a book prize and 32 journalism awards. He's also been shortlisted for 38 additional honors. The Vancouver Magazine referred to him as arguably Vancouver's most thoughtful journalist. He frequently gives talks in Canada and around the world. Todd is the author or editor of 3 successful books, the most recent being Cascadia, The Elusive Utopia, exploring the spirit of the Pacific Northwest. He has received several educational scholarships, including the 8-month Jack Shadbolt Fellowship in Humanities at Simon Fraser University. In 2015, he was elected chair of the International Association for Religion Journalists, which has more than 600 members in 90 countries. Todd is also the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the Vancouver School of Theology. So I ask you now to welcome Douglas Todd as our main speaker.
Thanks very much. Just put on a timer here. Thanks for inviting me to kick off this series. It sounds like it's going to be a very good series. Can you hear me? I'll put this on top of the computer, okay? Series called Does Immigration Matter? And I think most people here probably have a short answer to that, and yes is the answer. It matters a lot, especially in this country that's been more than almost any country defined by immigration, more than anything else, except for perhaps we've been defined by the snow and the rain in Vancouver. But immigration is probably the biggest story in the country, which is what makes it so strange. You guys were referring to, why is immigration a taboo, virtually a taboo subject in this country when it is so foundational to our cities especially, but the whole country? There's a consensus in Canada that overall immigration's been a positive thing for the country, but we're also one of the last countries in the world to have an actual discussion or debate about some of the complexities around the subject. And I think that's why, Chris, and you just said it, that's why they're sponsoring this series. Many people and some commentators in the media, they talk about it's important to have a discussion about immigration issues, but nobody ever gets around to it in a kind of a public way. We talk about it over at the bar or at dinner parties or something like that, and it's often doesn't go too far. I'm trying to get a discussion going in the kind of the middle. I mean, I feel like there's polls on this issue on both ends, maybe 15% of the population at both ends that I'm not going to reach either way, but I'm interested in the kind of the 70% in the middle who are willing to talk about uncomfortable issues. They don't have to be uncomfortable, but if you've never talked about them, they will be uncomfortable, I guess. And that, you know, the opinion polls increasingly show some skepticism about immigration policy, not about immigrants themselves, but about policy. With about half now say that there's too many immigrants coming to this country. So it's great that Shachi Kurl, she's from the Angus Reid Institute, she's doing some polling pretty well as we speak on immigration as an issue, and she's going to be the third speaker. And they're trying to get their polling out on immigration just before the first debate. So that'll be, I hope to do a story on it. And so I do want to thank you guys for sponsoring this discussion. And, well, actually, for all the work you've done with refugees over the years. Sorry, that's the main thing. I did a story, yeah. I did a story out of the Drake Street Center 12 or 15 years ago. It was a real eye-opener and a cramped little place, but you accomplished so much, and it's cool to be here, and it's such a bright, lively place. And I must say the energy in the place when I was here earlier just seemed kind of healthy, like not authoritarian, open, allow staff to do what they do, not micromanage them, whatever. But I won't be speaking tonight about refugees, because I wasn't asked to, and I don't know that much about them, although I do have some thoughts on it. I follow a guy named Paul Collier on refugees quite a bit, a guy from Britain. I've actually tended to more write about rich immigrants, and especially about the housing crisis in Vancouver and how foreign capital has been a part of that. So that's, and some of us have got onto that in the last 5 or 6 years, and that was it was a taboo subject, actually, how wealthy migrants or even foreign investors who don't even live here or don't intend to become immigrants, how they were influenced in the housing market and still are. But we've been told that our stories and columns of stuff have led to the NDP bringing in, and the Liberals before them, bringing in the foreign buyers tax, bringing in the vacancy tax, and the speculation tax, all of which are designed to try and curb demand from people who don't earn their living here. I can say, some people think they're controversial. I think they're pretty good policies, but whatever. Let's see. Yeah. So there's so many migration issues, it's just actually mind-blowing as I've got into this, but I'm going to focus tonight on the issue of, you guys sort of deal with settlement here. I'm focusing a bit more on the idea of integration as more the long game. How does integration happen after immigrants get settled, or is it not happening? Yeah, as I say, this is a kind of a discussion that I find immigrants can talk about easily, but the domestic-born seem to have trouble with it. So I forge ahead, and I'm also interested in philosophy. I could have put that into. And there's the two major questions of philosophy are, what is real? And then the second question is, how then shall we live? So when I come to the migration beat and diversity, I do focus a lot on what is real. And I don't think most Canadians really know what's real. They don't want to know for some reasons we can imagine. For example, somebody did a poll and asked how many Canadians, how many immigrants come in each year? And only 9% got within 100,000 of the right answer. And the right answer is, or the current answer is 310,000, roughly, immigrants a year, plus about 50,000 refugees a year. But that's just an example of how little Canadians actually know. the rate we bring in immigrants into Canada is 3 times higher per capita than the United States and about 4 times higher per capita than Germany. And as you probably know, since you're here, you're interested in the subject, most countries don't take any immigrants. So it is kind of a Western developed country phenomenon and Canada right at the sort of the edge of it in terms of openness. Very few Canadians realize that Canada is now taking in another 1 million guest workers and international students each year. About 200,000 of which come to Metro Vancouver. Also little known is the fact that 56% of newcomers are moving to the country's 3 biggest cities, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So as I say, there's many issues I could have discussed, but I'm going to focus on integration, and the title of this talk, therefore, is Unity Possible in a Metropolis of Enclaves? Instead of using the word unity, I could have used the word cohesion, or I could have used the word harmony, which is kind of more of a Confucian term that gets used a lot in Richmond, for example, as the Intercultural Committee tries to get dialogue going on this sort of topic on integration. Just a sec. And it's a good approach in Richmond, where now 54% of the population is ethnic Chinese. But I chose unity as the title because Pierre Trudeau used to use it, the father of the current prime minister, when all the negotiations were happening about Quebec and whether it would leave and kind of finding ways to keep Quebec in. He kept talking about we still need the idea of unity, not just separate, French and English populations. And he also brought in multiculturalism. It was part of that picture too, that he didn't want us, I think at one point he said, we don't want Canada to become a nation of shopping malls, which was a pretty good quote, which I've never looked at the context for it, actually. So a bit about myself. I've covered religion and ethics for many decades now. It's been a wild, enlightening experience. In Vancouver, when you cover the Muslims, you're covering people from more than 100 countries. I've been to mosques where people are from 50 different countries. It's amazing. Vancouver's quite unusual for having such diversity within its such a national diversity within its Muslim population. So I get to hang out with Sikhs, who are mostly from the Punjab. Buddhists are they're westernized, a lot of them, but there's also from China and East Asia. Catholics from the Philippines, there's like 100,000 Filipino Catholics in the city. Evangelicals, they tend to come from, they're Western, but also come from Korea. There's a Korean church in Surrey. I was there one day, it was 2,500 people. And me and a professor were the only white guys. I've written about diversity as it relates to gender and sexual orientation and all that stuff too. But about 8 years ago, editors asked me to write more about migration, since they realized this is the big issue. And it's just extended my coverage of the diversity beat. It's been really an amazing adventure with a steep learning curve. I've discovered immigration couldn't be more complex. For example, somebody recently said they learned there's about 200 different statuses of being from immigrant to a refugee to a citizen to somebody who can vote or somebody can't vote to permanent residents to all these different foreign students have different statuses. It gets incredibly complicated. I've talked a lot to immigration lawyers, and they're blowing my mind about what I can learn. I'm born in Vancouver. My parents were born here. My spouse is an immigrant. About half the people I hang out with. In my personal life and my reporting, I travel around a lot and volunteer. So I've learned to have incredible admiration for the people who make what I consider a kind of earth-shattering choice to leave their homelands to start a new life. So to get to the topic, this summer I worked with the Vancouver Sun's data guy and to create interactive maps of the ethnic makeup of Metro Vancouver neighborhoods. They show a city that is, the face of a city that's 45% foreign-born. That's almost unheard of in the world, to have that many people foreign-born in a city or a region. Toronto is a bit higher, but they're really exceptional. New York City, for example, is 35% foreign-born. Paris is about 13% foreign-born. Very cosmopolitan cities, right? Shanghai, just as for contrast, is less than 2% foreign-born. And it's considered the most cosmopolitan city in China. So we are a real experiment happening here that I think it's important to talk about. I think it's mostly going really well. But let's get into some of the details of it too. The interactive mapping also shows you how ethnic enclaves have increased by 30 times since 1982 in Canada. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians are increasingly choosing to live near people of the same culture, religion, and ancestry. For instance, large portions of North Surrey are now 75% South Asian, mostly Punjabi and Sikh. Large sections of Richmond are 75% Chinese. Same time, 75% of places like Tawasin or North Vancouver are white. And the Gulf Islands, for example, are 97% white, which is pretty amazing, actually. Vancouver Island tends to be pretty white. In the last decade, the number of Filipinos, they've been the largest group that come in the most rapid. Their numbers have grown by 60% in Metro Vancouver in the last decade. And Filipinos tend to spread around. It's quite interesting. A few kind of small enclaves around Joyce Street, SkyTrain station of 25% or something like that. I just thought I'd just show you the little interactive map we created just for a couple of minutes that would just illustrates graphically what I'm talking about. So here's just an example where people of Indian origin, where do they tend to live? And as you see in South Surrey, or North Surrey, I should say, the dark blue shows 60 to 70% South Asian population. Or sorry, we're using Statistics Canada data there. It shows they call this ethnicity Indian for whatever. It's not perfect. You know, neighborhoods that are 60% Indian, then 7% English, that sort of thing. Anyways, the overview, as you can see, it's pretty concentrated with a bit more in South Vancouver. And then I'll just quickly show, say, Chinese. No, I'll show European. So that's everybody from Europe. So you can see how the concentrations of Europeans tend to be outside, in sort of the suburbs. Let's see, Langley and South Surrey, Tawasin. Kitsilano tends to be pretty kind of European. Parts of North Vancouver, though actually it's getting kind of mixed over there too. And there are studies, I won't get into tonight, showing that whites are moving around too. Some are moving out of certain ethnic neighborhoods, increasingly ethnic neighborhoods. Let's see, Chinese. You tend to see the concentration in Richmond, these places, 88% ethnic Chinese in that block that the little hand is on. Same that, 78%. You drive around there and you don't sort of notice it, actually. It's just sort of normal residential neighborhoods, kind of often new, and nothing distinctive in the architecture or anything. It's interesting. Let's see, and I'll just because I seem to have a lot of Iranian friends, I'll look them up there. Where are they? They're a much smaller group, right? But you can see, it doesn't really show it too much. Around North Vancouver, 23% around the foot of the Lionsgate Bridge. And then I was just thinking it's kind of fun. Maybe, let's see if I can do it. Go into this neighborhood right where we are right now. if I can find it, do it properly. It's called Grandview, right? Broadway, there's Nanaimo, there's Victoria. So you go there. Oh, I'll go for, what should we look at? Say Chinese. Sorry, it's not working. I'm almost through with this. Yeah, so I think we're right there. 40% Chinese in this neighborhood to this side, 13% English, etc. And then you go to the other side of the block, it's 16% Chinese, 26% English. So who knows why that happened, but it's really interesting to me. I'm sort of a data nut, so I get into this stuff. Anyways, that's all for that. But I recommend you check it out someday. So what do scholars say about the rise of enclaves, especially like the ones in Richmond and North Surrey? They say they can be there's positive aspects to enclaves. Like University of Victoria scholar Zheng Wu has found immigrants feel comforted and protected by moving to enclaves with people of their own ethnicity. And it's, of course, understandable, especially when you're a newcomer. But Zheng Wu has also found a downside. He's concluded that living in ethnic enclaves reduces a newcomer's sense of belonging to Canada. In addition, you might have heard about the kind of a famous study by Robert Putman of Harvard University. He found in a major research project about 5 years ago that people's sense of trust goes down in neighborhoods that are highly diverse. That's sort of the overall view. It gets more complicated as you get into how long people have been into neighborhoods and all that sort of stuff. He also found that trust even went down within the ethnic group, which is a strange finding. He wasn't happy with his finding because he's a liberal guy, and he thought, oh, this is maybe not a good message for, maybe it shows there are things to talk about. So no one really knows how things will turn out in a few decades in Metro Vancouver, but I'm left with two questions. If ethnic enclaves continue to expand in Canada, will residents' trust go down and their sense of social isolation go up? Or will the city be able to come up with the values and institutions that can foster some sense of unity among its eclectic residents? Will there be ties that bind us together that will encourage a sense of common purpose? And I'm just as interested in getting your views on this as just saying my own, but we'll save that to later and go from there. So I'm looking at tonight at 5 things that I think might be barriers to kind of a national community cohesion. And then I'll add 5 things that are kind of hopeful for a future of harmony or even unity. So what are the main barriers? Some societies are, as you know, are very homogenous. They're too similar. They're too stultifying. They're too monolithic. There's societies when everybody is expected to conform to the same values. And Canadians have clearly shown we don't want that. We're individualistic, freedom-loving kind of culture. But as mentioned, some highly diverse societies can be less cohesive and less trusting. I can't be definitive about these barriers, because the data is a bit loose on some of them, but I'm going to try them out. And there's one place to start with the kind of data on the reality of what's going on, and that's with the study that the Vancouver Foundation did. They've done it twice, actually, now, on what are the issues that most bother people in Metro Vancouver. And they found that loneliness and isolation were the biggest issue that people tend to mention. And there's a suggestion also that things might be getting worse in Metro Vancouver. They recently polled 4,000 people in English and Chinese, and found there's, quote, a major decline in people participating in community life in the past 5 years in Metro Vancouver. Here's a quote from the Vancouver Foundation report. Our interactions with strangers revealed us to be friendly but reserved. Many people in Metro Vancouver reported interacting with each other in public community spaces by smiling and saying hello, but fewer than half are willing to respond to a question from a stranger, and only a few will ask a question or initiate a conversation. So I don't know about you, but I find that kind of shocking that 3 in 4 residents of Metro Vancouver won't start a conversation with a stranger. And that doesn't even get to asking somebody out for a date. You know, I wish it'd be great if Vancouver Foundation compared Vancouver to other places in Canada or wherever, but that's startling. I mean, this whole thing about beware of strangers has been kind of a disaster, actually, especially for kids. So here are 5 kind of things I see as possible challenges to cohesiveness and connection in the city. One, I'll speak about this one a bit more than the others because it's a bit complicated. So one, different values could be a challenge to harmony. As many of you know, there's been a discussion over the years about whether there's such a thing as, or what people call Canadian values. The discussion is basically over whether most immigrants coming to Canada are ready to integrate into the country's culture and adopt so-called Canadian values. Of course, some people question the entire kind of premise of the question. They argue that humans are the same around the world, and there are not really different values associated with different cultures and nations. But when you look at the data, the reality is that even though people obviously have their individual characters within a culture, the culture does shape who we are to quite a big extent. The World Values Surveys is something that happens quite often around the planet. It's the data they come up with, they survey people in every country, and the data they come up with is used by the UN and the World Bank, so it's, you know, it's serious stuff. And I'll just take a couple of examples of kind of values they've asked people. They've actually asked people around about 20 values, actually. But one they do is the value of tolerance. They found that 83% of the residents of France and Canada value tolerance, 83%. And so do 80% of Taiwanese, just to almost choose that randomly. But far few people in India, just 56%, think tolerance is a key virtue. So that's a bit of a gap. And what about the value of hard work? The survey found 90% of parents in China value hard work. Meanwhile, the proportion of Canadian parents who emphasizes it is only 54%. And that's okay to have these differences in values, kind of group values, but it's also interesting to know that there are those differences and to take them seriously. I could go on with many examples, but the simple lesson from the World Values Survey is that human values are all over the map, literally. And there's maybe one more big value is worth mentioning, and that's about a religion. For example, in the Middle East, more than 9 out of 10 people say religious faith is very important. And it's important to emphasize it. But fewer than, say, Germany, it's only 1 in 10 parents who value religious faith. And in Canada, it's about 3 in 10. So we're a bit in the low middle. About 3 in 10 Canadians care if their children believe in God. And as I say, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad to believe in God, because so much depends on which kind of God you believe in, right? And how that will determine your actions. But the point is that there are big differences in values in regards to religious faith. And on that topic, one of the more worrying questions about values for me arises when people around the world are asked about blasphemy laws. Those are including laws around apostasy. Apostasy is when a person decides to leave the faith they grew up in. Unfortunately, at least to me it's unfortunate, the Pew Research Foundation, very respected global research company, has found in dozens of countries, such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Iran, most of the population agrees with the law of their land on apostasy. And that law often states that an apostate, someone who leaves the faith, should be subjected to death. It's not always enforced, but that's the law. And some of us, even very recently, heard a refugee from Saudi Arabia, a young woman, say she left because she didn't want her head cut off, because she had told her family she was leaving the faith, and she didn't think, she claimed refugee status. I don't know her story in detail, but she gave a little talk. She also said she didn't want to have her life controlled by males, which, you know, Saudi Arabia is a patriarchal culture. So there are differences, and people who try to say, oh, we're all the same, they're not paying attention. The polls are perfect, but imperfect, but people around have different values. Just a little bit more on values. And then there's the other question, is there such a thing as Canadian values? And, you know, Canadians are so vague about who they are and so nice and stuff like that, that often we think, oh, no, not really. We're just, whoever happens to be in the neighborhood or something. And there is a small proportion of Canadians who say there is no Canadian values or identity, but I beg to differ, and so do the large proportion. Angus Reid Institute asked this question, does Canadians, does Canada have a unique culture? And 80% said yes, whatever the definition. I've did a piece on it, talked to scholars about what are some of the Canadian values. An American professor really takes an interest in Canadian stuff. She's from Oregon. She said, one value Canadians tend to share is not being like Americans. And to the professor, that meant not being overbearing, trying to be global citizens, makes sense, and identifying with multiculturalism. As I say, I've interviewed lots of professors about this, and I kind of like some of the other answers they came up with. Canadians are characterized by a northern mindset, the snow and the rain and the whatever, characterized by a legal and parliamentary tradition derived from Europe, generally solid support for welfare state policies, a belief in coexistence within multinational complexity, including with First Nations, a general understanding that ethnic origins should take second place to things we share as Canadians, and a widespread commitment to gender equality. These Canadian values are not all necessarily just Canadian values, because they're around the planet too, in different places. But I think our different approaches to them in Canada could be a challenge in regards to unity. That said, I don't think it's insurmountable. It's just, let's have a realistic talk about it, like what is real. It can be really interesting. So I'll run more quickly through the other 4 possible barriers to cohesion. Language can be a barrier. I find that sort of hard to say because I'm completely intimidated by languages. And I do not envy people who really are feeling compelled to learn. I think people have so many different degrees of how much they learn a new language. My wife speaks 5 languages, but I try not to hate her for it because I just speak English and a bit of poor French. But it is hard, I think, to create a sense of neighborliness and community when it is hard to communicate with the person who lives next door or who you meet at the community center or whatever, or meet at shopping. And as people probably know, one place where this issue has come to the fore has been in the debate over Chinese language signs enrichment and all the complexity that goes with that. A third possible barrier, this is something nobody talks about, but ethnic economies, well, I shouldn't say no, scholars talk about them. Ethnic economies are common all over the world. An ethnic economy exists when members of the same ethnic group make their livelihoods by collaborating almost exclusively with members of the same ethnic group. For example, Miami has a Cuban ethnic economy within the larger economy. Several journalists in Vancouver actually have written about ethnic economies in the construction and trucking business, and particularly they're in a ride-hailing service that is available only to those who speak Mandarin. That got a few people, journalists, worked up. And like ethnic enclaves, the beneficial thing about ethnic economies is they help newcomers feel supported, both culturally, linguistically, and financially. But ethnic economies also run the danger of exacerbating group isolation. So for private schools, particularly religious ones, might be a bit problematic, as the academics like to say. I won't go too far in making this argument that private schools are a barrier, but it is a claim made by others who, in some ways, more experienced than me, including former federal Liberal cabinet minister Ujjal Dosanjh. He worries about private schools, whether they are evangelical, Sikh, Muslim, Catholic, Hutterite, or defined by wealth. He thinks it's being an old-fashioned sort of egalitarian. He thinks it creates silos to have students learn mostly within one subculture, within the larger culture. So 5, are religions good or bad for social cohesion? And this is somebody who's written about religion a lot and is incredibly sympathetic to kind of the religious and spiritual impulse. Religious organizations can definitely help some newcomers integrate. They can help connect immigrants to the larger society in multiple ways, including that the church right across the street takes an active interest in refugees, actually. Many churches, mosques, and temples offer services in multiple languages, and they're on the front lines of settlement and integration, including with ESL programs. You go by Broadway Church, the evangelical church on Broadway, it's got all the ESL programs that they're offering. But some religious organizations can also divide people within an ethnic group. The leaders of some religious groups in Canada, for instance, are adamant against intermarriage, and a very small number can even promote extremism or violence. That said, as I say, I'm waffling on this one because the role of religion in private schools in multicultural society can get really complex, and it's ridiculous to be black and white about it, but it's interesting to be sort of aware that there can be a downside to some of this. Okay, so what about some of the possible good news? I think my time's okay. So what can be our hope for things that will increase cohesion, unity, or harmony, whichever term you want to use? I say language is a challenge, but also a solution. Language differences can create grave difficulties in regards to cohesion, and just look at Quebec and long-standing French-English tensions in Canada. To me, it's been an incredible boon that Francophone Quebec is part of the rest of Canada, but the benefits of being a country with 2 official languages have not come without some division too. Language barriers can contribute to isolation in an ethnic group. However, the studies that describe the upside of removing language gaps could not be more conclusive. The benefits of learning in Canada English or French, say. They clearly show that newcomers to Canada who learn these languages will be more successful in education. They will be more successful in the workplace. They will earn quite a bit more money. And there's even been some health studies that found people who come to Canada and learn to become fluent in English and French actually have better health. They're less prone to depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. And they actually have physical health that is better, less heart problems, less cancer, live longer lives. Yeah, pretty powerful kind of data. And I know how much commitment and devotion it takes to learn a new language, but the benefits couldn't be clearer. So I see intermarriage as a positive trend. There is hope in the ideal of mixed unions. Couples who intermarry across ethnicities are at the front lines of interculturalism. I admire them. They're so interesting to hang out with and see how intermarried couples kind of read the culture. Way more sophisticated than most of us. Intermarriage rates are growing in the US, especially between whites, blacks, and Hispanics, but they're not rising nearly so rapidly in Canada. The overall rate of mixed unions in Canada is expanding only by about 1 percentage point a decade. Interethnic unions now account for 4.6% of all couples in Canada, but that's only about half of the rate of the US and Britain, actually. And I think it could, and I'm not alone in thinking it could be because a kind of a demographic anomaly that relates to the topic I started out with, and that is the rise of ethnic enclaves in Canada's major cities. Feng Hu is a researcher at University of Victoria, and he's been with a team who's found that the larger an ethnic group becomes in a city, the less likely its members are to marry outside their group. For instance, it's so interesting, the intermarried rates of visible minorities in mid-sized Canadian cities is far higher than it is in the big cities. For instance, in Kelowna and Victoria, the intermarriage rate of a visible minority is 40%. So that's 4 times higher than in Metro Vancouver. So people in smaller centers without ethnic enclaves, such as these places, Kelowna, appear more motivated to go outside their ethnocultural group for friends, dates, and marriage partners. On the other hand, Feng Hu's found that In Canadian metropolises where visible minorities account for almost half the population, the intermarriage rate is much lower than in these places. And the intermarriage rate among visible minorities is just 12% in Vancouver. Toronto, it's 11%, compared to the 40% in, say, Kelowna, which yeah. So people seem to feel little need to find a partner outside their ethnoculture group when they live among hundreds of thousands of people with similar backgrounds. And researchers do caution about reading too much into these stats in regards to whether integration is working or not, but there's still valuable data to explore. And as I say, the positive take-home is that intermarriage is slowly growing across the country. And I think it will eventually lead to more kind of intercultural understanding and harmony. So what's another third positive thing as far as I'm concerned? Their global tolerance studies are a positive sign for social cohesion. The United Nations, working with people such as UBC economist John Helliwell, recently put together some fabulous studies on the happiness levels of immigrants. And they came up with something called the UN's World Happiness Report. It showed that immigrating to Canada makes people happier. It shows most of the immigrants who have been arriving each year in Canada become happier than they were before they left their country of origin. This happiness report has a second part. It also confirms that Canadians are on the most tolerant and welcoming people in the world. The report reveals that Canada, they surveyed, Gallup, working with the UN, surveyed people in 115 countries, 1,000 people each in each country, and asked them 3 questions. I don't think I wrote them down. It was, what do you think about immigrants coming in? How do you feel about them being in your neighbor? And how do you feel about them marrying into your family? Is that good or bad? In Canada came out the world's 4th most accepting country for migrants, which is, that's serious, right? I think. Despite the media reporting accusations that Canadians are inclined to be xenophobic, this imperfect but generally kind country has been a beacon of light, at least to a fraction of the people who say they want to permanently leave their homelands. And a different study on that just found out 700 million people around the world want to permanently leave their country for a better place. So migrants to Canada end up with virtually the same life satisfaction levels as native-born Canadians. And that's, when it comes to happiness, Canada's 7th happiest on the planet, apparently. So there are outbreaks of racism in Canada, including some of which have been deadly. But these studies still suggest that there's not that much overt racism in Canada, especially compared to other countries that are far less welcoming of immigrants. UBC's Daniel Hebert, who he's done some work on racism, and along with others, he's generally concluded that about 3 to 5% of Canadians might be sort of actually actively racist. That is, he didn't use this definition, but that is people who think they're superior because of the color of their skin and are willing to discriminate based on it. So 3 to 5%. Serious, but not, you know, the impression some people have. So the good news is the vast majority of Canadians, whether new immigrants or member of the host society, seem quite prepared to try to get along. The UN report serves to remind Canadians that discrimination is on a continuum in Canada as at the more positive end of it. The UN's happiness report also suggests Canadians are doing a lot right, and the vast majority of immigrants are benefiting from it. How can that not be hopeful? 4, I think immigration is a long game. Even though immigrants themselves become happier after moving to Canada, I think, you know, the sort of truism, and it is true, is that the real deep benefits happen within the, I think they call it the 2nd generation, which is the kids of the immigrants, right? This sort of thing happens after settlement, which is an accomplishment in itself, and when integration really starts to occur. It particularly happens with the children of immigrants are educated here. For instance, studies show that children of immigrants do far better at getting into university and obtaining high-skilled jobs than do the children of parents who are born in Canada. That is especially true of 2nd generation or 1st generation children of Chinese and South Asian parents. The success stories are amazing, really. So 5, my last one, I think cultural curiosity is a positive thing for Canadians. It's going to be necessary to enhance cohesion. As Kathy briefly said, I'm the chair right now of the International Association of Religion Journalists. It's been going for 6 years. We started it. We have members in 80 countries from every continent except Antarctica. The board of directors is a Muslim from Indonesia, a Muslim from Pakistan, and a Muslim from Algeria. 2 Jews from around the world, a lapsed Catholic, a liberal Protestant, and a Mormon. And I'm dealing with these people all the time. I'm learning about the world through them. It's like fantastically interesting. So how does this relate to Canada? It's connected to how a senior Ottawa official once told leading Canadian sociologist Reg Bibby that, quote, multiculturalism sometimes amounts to little more than staying out of the way of each other. And sometimes I feel like that's what's going on in Metro Vancouver. People are polite, they smile as they walk by, but mostly we're staying out of each other's way. Please, at the question period, tell me if obviously there's many examples of that not being the case, but maybe it's sort of a overall kind of mood. So how can we counteract such an unsatisfying approach? I've written quite a few times about UBC psychologist Era Narenzian. He recommends people develop more cultural curiosity. And Era grew up in Lebanon, where ethnic diversity suddenly, I mean, people used to call it the Paris of the Middle East, very diverse religiously and ethnically, but it blew up literally in the 90s, I think it was 90s. And when he left, still somewhat traumatized actually, he's written about it with PTSD. So his advice comes from the experience of when inter-ethnic and inter-religious realities turns into a civil war. So he takes this quite seriously. The core meaning of the term diversity is difference. And as Era says, one of the few ways to get to know someone who's different is by asking them questions about themselves and their background. He says it's actually more racist to just assume everybody's the same. So to counteract this kind of bland indifference to difference, we need to be more curious about each other. I've written once about we should not be afraid to ask that question, where are you from? Some people apparently find it offensive, and I guess somebody could say it in a sort of a hostile, suspicious way, but I think it's still a very worthwhile question in a place like Metro Vancouver where most people aren't from here. Only 1/3 of the population in Metro Vancouver is from BC. So it's just a normal question. It can get conversations going. Some people say, oh, you don't want to do that because you're othering somebody by asking them questions like that. But I think this academic somebody might disagree, this concept of othering is one of the most loose and unfortunate concepts around because it gets misused and overused. And the truth is, we all are others to each other. I mean, that's what makes people interesting. My wife is an other to me. My friends are others to me. I'm always trying to get to know them. I'm always trying to be curious about them. So just like in personal relationships, I think getting to know somebody takes risks. Leaping into the unknown, being a bit awkward, actually. Luckily, I'm sort of a journalist. I'm used to asking questions and just seeing what happens. And it's amazing, the questions you ask as a journalist and just as me, and people love to talk about themselves. It's fantastic. If we're not willing to be awkward in a relationship, what we end up with is avoidance. And that is not much good to anyone when it comes to creating harmony. So maybe that's the ultimate aim of the talk here, is to suggest that if we really want to obtain more unity in Metro Vancouver and Canada, we're all going to have to recognize some fascinating differences exist, and we have to be prepared to understand them, including, most importantly, differences of opinion, which seem to be a clampdown on these days. It's not only difference of ethnicity and immigrant status or whatever, but of opinion. Let's be open about them. The diverse and often isolated residents of Metro Vancouver are going to have to become much bolder at trying to get to know each other. And I say we give it more of a try than some of us have already done, and I think it could work. Thank you. Just stay here.
Come have a seat.
Great.
We'll give you this before we move into questions, I promise not to take up a lot of the time because I'm sure you didn't come to listen to me talk. But one of the things I really found interesting when you framed it is that question of what is real and how then do I live? Because I think one of the things that when we talk about, and I'm curious on your thoughts of this, when we talk about integration, we live in a country where it's integration, the idea of two-way model of integration. And yet I feel like quite often when we talk, we recognize diversity within newcomer groups and immigrant groups. Mm-hmm. We acknowledge super diversity, the idea that there's incredible diversity even with the same group. Yeah. And yet I feel like when we talk about integration, it's somehow this integration, the idea that we have one Canadian. Yeah. And, you know, in a time of truth and reconciliation, when we have to really grapple with, as whether you're a newcomer, whether you're Canadian born, this idea of what are we integrating into? Mm-hmm. And how does it not become an American assimilation model where the idea of, even as we talk about integration, really it's code for assimilation?
Yeah. Somebody I was talking to, a young person, said the whole notion of the mosaic model of Canadian multiculturalism and the melting pot of the United States, they're kind of high-level concepts that maybe don't have too much to do with reality. You know, I wouldn't say that Americans forced their life, or it is a tricky subject. I mean, as soon as you bring it up, I start going, oh man, yeah. But I can point to those values that some of those scholars talked about that sort of identify Canadians. There's about 8 or 10 that not everybody believes them, but 80 to 90%. Mm-hmm. And I think they're worth upholding, not just acting like Canada's a blank slate, right? And you can do whatever you want. And then as soon as I look at the figures on apostasy and how, you know, there's 20 or 30 countries that have laws where apostasy is illegal or, as I said, the death penalty. I think, no, that's not a Canadian value. That's pretty clear. So there does have to be give and take happen. I don't think Canada will ever be anywhere near monolithic. It's just not the nature of this country. But we'll always be highly pluralistic, and that's the way it is. And in some ways, we won't have as distinct a culture as some places, like, I don't know, France or Philippines or something like that, right? Where there aren't as many different people. But that's okay.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're going to turn to questions. We want to make sure as many people as possible have an opportunity to participate. So what we thought we would do is take 3 to 4 questions at a time, using a mixture of both individuals who are in the audience here live with us, as well as Bahar will be helping with online questions, and then provide Douglas with an opportunity to respond, and then go to the next set of questions. Does anyone have a question to begin?
Hello, I'm myself an international student here, and I really like the concept of group isolations and private schools because when I moved here last year, I feel that there's like a lot of these things going on around, which is keeping us away from the diversity we can experience and we was here to experience. So how do we make sure that like, you know, we can move out of the diversity and this doesn't happen like what is happening around? Because when this happens, like the isolation, the group isolation, as like I'm from Punjab, so I'll be recognized as Punjabi, and most of the people are like, you know, all this area is like concentrated with the same thing. So how we can prevent this and we can enjoy the diversity and we make sure all the surrounding suburbs doesn't like grow this way.
Yeah, I'm just going to move because that's light's right in my face.
So,
Sorry, you're going to ask a couple. Thanks, I'll get back to that.
Take one.
Hi,
We're just going to move you right here.
my name is Jim. I just wanted to know about, you didn't mention anything about Brazilian newcomers. Yeah, I wanted to know
There's
about
not too
that a
many,
bit.
but there's more coming apparently.
Yeah, there's quite a few actually.
Yeah, is that where you're from? Is that where you're from?
Yeah, more or less. I'm Canadian, born in Switzerland, but I lived in Canada a long time, in
Okay.
Brazil a long time.
I think Kathy's going to get maybe another question. Or?
Does anyone else? One more and then we'll turn to you.
Good. Thanks for being here. Maclean's magazine a few years ago had an interesting article where they suggested actually tripling immigration numbers. And let's see about getting Canada up to a population of 100 million. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Thanks.
Great. Just with the international student, were I think you were saying that you've come here and you feel isolated within the school. Is that what you're saying?
No, I was like, so like the kind of group isolation, you know, like where we can see the one community is concentrated in just. Where we can see one community is concentrated in just one area, like Sarivia, as we
Yeah.
talked about, is more of the Indian community, and if we move to Richmond, which is more of the Asians, and so like that concepts kind of like keeps the diversity away because they have their own subcultures which get integrated in that particular area.
Right.
And when you visit that area or when you live around that area, you kind of feel like the same thing, like that you can experience there. But like the reason we was here to like experience that diversity, like where we can have like, let's say we have like 4 cultures and we have 25% of all that. But we can see like with time this is growing
Right.
more, when people are moving in and they prefer to live in their community instead of living in diversity.
right.
So how like governments or politicians or with laws they can prevent that, or what we as a people should make sure like how we can be around that stuff.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for saying that. I've done quite a few stories on international students, and it's fascinating what's going on. There's 120,000 international students in Metro Vancouver. So it's having a big impact on all sorts of things, not only schools, but rental accommodation and that sort of stuff. And I have talked to some people who regardless of what exactly you were saying, that they get tired of coming here and just hanging around with other Chinese students, and it's hard, or maybe South Asian students, it's hard for them to learn English and that sort of stuff. And then some of them are getting drawn into the sort of the ethnic economies where there's a bit of exploitation going on there too. But so I know some people talk about international students, so they didn't want to come to the United States or Canada because they wanted to go to Holland so that they could get away from people of their own ethnicity, right, and learn something new. So, I'm not sure what the government can do to kind of help you experience more of Canada. I think that's what you're saying. But it's something that, I mean, the international student ratios at some schools are getting up to like 40%. So it's something I'd have to talk to more international students about what they think they could get out of it. As for Brazil, not too much to say there other than there's a real push on to bring more Brazilian international students here. And to have, actually, even the Liberal government there's so many international students from China and India right now. They're 60% of the total. They're trying to diversify the foreign student population. And then, yeah, 100 million Canadians in the near future. Doug Saunders writes about that, right? And so the Conference Board of Canada or something like that. Some of the corporations want that because high immigration is good for boosting the GDP. But studies show it's not necessarily good for boosting per capita income. So there's a trade-off there. And the other thing that some of those guys, people who want 100 million population soon, they don't take seriously that I think it's like 80% of newcomers go to the major cities. And that's, people say Canada's a big country. It is a big country, but the reality is migrants go to the big cities for lots of good reasons. And you can't control that in Canada because everybody has mobility rights, right? So it's, yeah, go ahead.
Does anyone else have questions, either online or in person?
Hi, my name is Lamuel. First of all, I would like to acknowledge your topic today. And previously, I enjoyed most of your write-ups at Vancouver Sun for over the years, probably about 20 years now, with different diverse of topic there. Thank you for sharing all those. My question now is, with the political climate south of the border that's going on towards immigration, as Canadian, are we being affected with what's going on there and what the policymakers are, I mean, if there's any changes with the policy or thinking of the federal government about this one?
Right, thanks. I mean, people wonder if there's going to be a kind of a populist movement develop in Canada, partly fueled or largely even fueled by immigration issues. And we end up with a strong man like Trump or something like that. Doesn't seem to be happening, but Canada is one of the few countries, as I say, that hasn't had a national immigration discussion. So you do wonder what's burbling under the surface a bit there. The U.S. has got such a different situation in regard to migration, mostly, concerns about the southern border. Canada has very protected borders, relatively speaking. We have water, or we have the United States as a kind of a buffer, so we don't get what's happened in Italy with people coming from boats to, across the ocean, Mediterranean, and we didn't get what happened to Sweden, which welcomed in what turns out to be more than the people were ready to accept. Yeah, and just put in a good word for the United States, because we Canadians, we do like to pretend we're not them. We're not as bad as them. But, on that survey of which are the most accepting countries in the world of migrants, U.S. actually came in 9th. And that's based on serious polling of people's views, right? So it's not a monster country when it comes to immigrants. But that, I guess the leaky border thing in this is what's made it so hot. And Trump is kind of taking advantage of it, right? So I don't really see that happening here, but nobody can predict the future. Yeah.
Hi. I feel like I resonate with a lot of what you said. I also did a master's around ethnic enclaves, so
Yeah?
personally
Really?
experienced it and studied it too.
Wow.
So my question is, with obviously the increase of ethnic enclaves and ethnic enclaves in terms of the economy also, and all those factors that you named, so how do we, as Canadian, in terms of our niceties, and we want to say we want to promote multiculturalism, and that's part of our identity and value. So in the reality of that, how do we actually do it? And for me, it's like, how do we create intercultural spaces where it's a city like this, we like to really celebrate culture, but very much just like celebrate just one culture at a time, where whether that's festival, holidays, which is great, but there's not a lot of mix of these intercultural spaces. And really, ultimately, it's like, how do we talk about race? So I would love to hear, like, how do we actually have these kind of conversation, because that's kind of where we need to start.
Yeah.
And we're kind of afraid to have those conversations because we don't want to be racist. We want to be like, we celebrate everyone, but
Yeah.
that doesn't accomplish really anything or create actually a real sense of multiculturalism in the landscape of ethnic enclaves.
Yeah, or interculturalism, as you say. No, I mean, that's the big question, right? There are sort of many answers to it, or responses, but no actual answer to how to do it. The Vancouver Foundation is, for instance, there's a story in today's paper or something about it, sponsoring kind of group meetings where people come to a common table, and I think there's a topic to discuss, and they're trying to encourage it to be multi-ethnic. I don't quite know how that works, but sounds like a good idea. I mean, it's obviously small level. They're only getting 20 or 30 people out. So that's a good experiment. Then at the sort of what's already, I mean, this does happen too, right? I was talking to somebody here, and he says, he's South Asian. He says, we show up at the Canucks, we're rabid fans, right? Like, sports actually is a pretty major area for, in whatever words one use, integration, interculturalism, standing beside the side of a soccer field when your kids are playing in a diverse team, or even going to the Canucks. I mean, people are connecting on a kind of a common thing. That's good. It sounds superficial, maybe it even is, but it's something. But I actually am interested in your study. I would like to see it. We could get that later. Maybe there's a story there. As time will, the old story used to be that time resolves integration. The Italians moved to, commercial drive or something like that, or the Greeks moved to kits 80 years ago, and then to be together, and then slowly integrated into the whole, throughout the city. But like the studies, I don't know what's going to happen, but the studies do show that, like I say, there's been a 30 times rise in the number of ethnic enclaves in Canada. And maybe they're going to be more solid than the old ones. I'm not answering your question about what to do, but maybe some brilliant person here has a response.
I don't have a response to that. My name's Sarah. You mentioned sports as a venues, as an opportunity for intercultural connection.
Yeah.
Have you ever given any thought to the role of public transit as an opportunity for intercultural connection? I often think about taking transit and how if you don't take transit, where do you have the chance to interact with the other people we share this little spot on the planet with in a way that transit, at least in this region, certainly exposes you to a real diversity in a way most of our other interactions don't have. And so I've wondered if you've ever given any thought about that.
No, I haven't, but then the kind of cliche negative answer off the bat is everybody's just staring at their phones on the bus and having no interaction. But the idea that the bus or the transit, SkyTrain, could become a place where something special happens is fantastic. Because that is, you see the incredible diversity of this place on the transit system. Can you think of something that somebody could sponsor to get people yakking a bit more? I could give a talk. Yes, no, that's true.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess going back to your question, back there, nobody's mentioned education, and education is so critical, and at an early age, and I think that's when you can mold opinions and you can, help really create greater tolerance. And I heard someone say that, you should treat racism like a disease, and you should vaccinate against it. And what this person meant was vaccinate them by education and starting at a really early age, so that tolerance and the values and the interaction and that space, you've got the space in the classrooms. Yeah. And while some of that is going on in the education system, I think a lot more could go on. So I just thought I'd add that.
No, I mean, you're right. The education systems, they're working very hard on anti-racism stuff. To be honest, sometimes I wonder if they're doing it too much, like creating this fear of each other, or getting everybody like walking on. I'm not in the school system, so I don't know actually what happens, but sort of walking too carefully and afraid to ask even where you're from, or and there if you're in the school system, enclaves form within the schools too. So definitely it's a very positive sign what's happening in education, and that's what I say. I did say that first children of immigrants do statistically extremely well in Canada. So just financially and educationally. So something's working there.
I was actually headed in the same direction, but I would even expand it and say even children who come here post-elementary, they're working their way into the universities. And we have these massive institutions. We're a highly educated, great proportion of our residents go through post-secondary education, and some of those, like SFU, is doing an amazing job of reaching out to different demographics, older demographics, and so on. I just wonder whether that's the place where we can create spaces for conversations, that
Right.
it's not education, but you can create fora for bringing people in. The way I think Alumni UBC does a really great job of having really interesting discussions.
Really?
So I just put that out there as if you wanted an idea, I think of those institutions. They're there,
Right.
they have space, they have expertise. You were quoting so many people there.
Yeah.
Maybe there's an opportunity to
For them to do
take
more in the wider community, like out beyond students.
that.
Yeah, yeah,
To
no, that's
create
true.
those discussions.
And
Yeah.
I just want to add that SFU Center for Dialogue is really starting to do more and more of that.
Right. Yeah, it is happening. I'm a friend of Joseph Wosk. He's sponsored the whole Philosopher's Cafe thing too. I don't know what the mix of crowd it was for that, but it was another idea of getting Canadians actually talking rather than Vancouverites talking rather than living in isolation and loneliness.
So immigration is an issue that we're seeing around the world on different national agendas and discussions in countries. I'd be intrigued to get your perspective too on, are there any countries that are approaching the conversation in a positive way and thinking about it, in a good light and things we can learn from?
Of which topic exactly?
Around integration.
Integration?
Yeah.
That's interesting, actually. You mentioned that. You know, people sometimes are critical of Denmark, but they're doing some pretty interesting things about getting people talking, which aren't on the tip of my tongue. I mean, one thing they even have is for, say, Danish people who went off to fight for ISIS and want to come back. They're actually kind of welcoming them back and putting them through this big education program out in the country and all this stuff and try to rehabilitate them rather than just sort of rejecting them. But that's just one kind of narrow example of some of the things that Scandinavian countries are pretty creative about some of this stuff. Way more kind of, I mean, you guys offer it here, all sorts of educational programs and job programs, and it is happening. I guess the theme of this is just the enclaves and whether there's a bit of concern that they are becoming pretty solid and might make a difference. I'm totally interested in actually the people who work here's opinion on that, but that's for another time.
Hi, I'm Resuchita. I'm a settlement worker, and I talk to immigrants, temporary foreign workers every day. That's part of my job, and so I come across clients like those who just arrived. So the first question I ask them is like, "How do you find Canada?" Or like, "Is your visualization of Canada the same as you had in the plane or when you had the visa?" And I say like, "Yeah, I like it. Like it's beautiful." And transportation is nice and all that. And for most refugees, it's peaceful. And yet they would say like, but I want to go back.
Yeah.
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 And I've spoken with clients who have been here 30 years. I'm assisting them for all the security. And what they say, it's lonely here, Resuchita. So the word lonely comes from newcomers.
Uh-huh.
Those who have been here 2 years, 3 years, and those who have been here 30 years. And it cuts across different skin color, different ages, different genders, and so like, okay, you know how it is. I said like, no, I don't know how it is. How is it to you? It's lonely here. Nobody cares. Yeah, so the word lonely comes from youth, middle-aged people, newcomers, and people have lived here 30 years.
Wow.
So I said like, okay, so that's really a realization for me. So I always come to think like, when I ask myself, how is it here for me? I would describe a lot of wonderful things, but when I would describe like, in terms of relationship, I have not given a word about it. Like I like the infrastructure, I like the election, it's clean and all that. Like corruption is nothing compared to the Philippines.
Yeah.
I come from Philippines and it's a very repressive and very difficult economically and all that thing. But in terms of relationship, I said like, I have not given a description about it too.
Yeah.
How is it for me? So it's the same with clients. Though, so
I should interview you too, because that was very eye-opening what you just said, and like you're based on real experience. And I mean, we could theorize about why that is, which is interesting. But then, I mean, so many of these talks, they always turn into what can we do about it? And I'm not I don't know. I'm not a public policy guy, but it'd be interesting. What do you think people could do about it? But also, like, Canada is a very individualistic place where, like, that Mandarin's version of multiculturalism might have some truth to it. We just mainly stay out of each other's way. And that doesn't build community or relationships or, you know, partnerships or marriages or whatever, right? If we're just sort of, it's that kind of lowest level of tolerance. This is sort of, okay, superficial politeness, right? Do you have any thoughts, briefly, since, about what could be done to help a person who's 30 years later still lonely?
Well, in my work, you know what what really comes across clients, because I assist clients mainly from Philippines, but across countries, is when I say some, like for example, I assist Tigrinya and I say Yakanyale, and say, oh, you speak Tigrinya? No, that's the only word I know. So like I try to pick up, and if it's Arabic, I said Ana Ismi Resuchita, it's like my name.
Yeah.
So I try to pick up, and then they tend to, you know, like connect with you. And then I was speaking with a Nigerian woman. I said, like, I've read about, you know, like Chimamanda. I said, oh, I'm from there. Oh, you speak Igbo? Yeah, I speak Igbo. And then they start to like connect with you. And then, of course, I tell them, I do outreach at St. Mary's. You could come. It's multi-ethnic and all that. And so
No,
it's a hard thing to do, but it's very uplifting. And you see the smiles.
I mean, the refugees, the immigrants I know, like in my family, you can sense they're from Europe. There's times where they just miss home and what they grew up with and that sort of stuff. Oh, I remember one thing, as you were speaking about, like, for young people to come here as immigrants, there is these studies, you guys are probably quite aware of it. It's very important for a young person to get here before kind of age 11. If they come when they're in their teens, especially Filipino kids, the studies show it's quite difficult. If they come when they're 15, it's so hard to get into a high school, into the kind of whole thing of it, because high schools are rough places, right, in terms of cliques and all that stuff. So it's really important for young kids to get here, what I just said.
Great. So we have time for one more question.
Well, thank you very much for all your words so far. We're here in a center which services government-assisted refugees.
Right.
And I'd just like to speak to the experience of privately sponsored refugees. I was part of a group on the Gulf Islands who sponsored refugees. And that was a number of years ago, and the friendships are still there. So when we're talking about integration, the potential, I think, for privately sponsored refugees to form more lasting relationships is there. And as I understand it, there are tens of thousands of dollars in bank accounts across the country that was raised at the time of the Syrian refugee crisis, and the matches were never made. The personnel in Canadian government offices around the world was cut. And so the follow-up for all of those initiatives, those generous initiatives, has gone nowhere. And I'm sure in many cases, the groups have disbanded by now. I don't know what has happened to the money. But it seems to me there might be room in a journalistic way to explore some of this and to urge that impetus to continue.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it's a gauge of what our country would like to do.
Yeah, and it's becoming a political issue too, with parties are taking. I mean, the Conservatives are pushing private sponsorships right now. I'm not sure what the other parties are saying, but that's one of the many. Like, there are so many issues involved in this whole migration and thing. It's really interesting, and that's one of them. But I'll get a card from you or something like that, or might follow up. Great.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everybody for your questions, for this discussion. Thank you to Douglas. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
So with the hour we've had so far, you begin to see how complex the dynamics around immigration are. You know, far be it we're not leaving today with any answers, but I think it begins the conversation and looking at it from different angles. Following up where you just left, that question that you raised, 34,000 privately sponsored refugees are currently in the backlog waiting to be processed. And the processing time in some countries is over 6 years now. So you see the generosity of Canadians wanting to engage in a real way with the global refugee crisis, but the processing and the systems are not responding to that generosity. We also, here at ISSofBC, working with government-assisted refugees, are very actively involved in a program that's been rebranded Canada Connects. And this may be something you're interested in at some point, where we recruit volunteers to volunteer with government-assisted refugees and other immigrants as a way of increasing their social network on a volunteer basis, and that's something that we're always looking for. But this complexity, and the aha for me looking at this is the fact that in a country like Canada that was built, other than on the Indigenous people, but on immigration, we're not having these discussions. And I just find it fascinating. It's like we're just taking all of this for granted, and somehow it magically works. And I find it, having worked in this area for a few decades now, every October 31st, November 1st, thereabouts, the Minister of Immigration stands up in the House of Commons and announces how many permanent residents, how many immigrants will be coming into this country. And the consultation around this is absolutely insufficient. So we, have been calling for a number of years, unanswered, for actually a Royal Commission on Immigration. We really feel that as a country going forward now and the increasing importance of immigration, that we really actually need a Royal Commission or a white paper on immigration that really digs deeper and involves Canadians from coast to coast to coast to better understand the dynamics around immigration and have a more active say, whether you agree or not, but an open debate, a safe debate that looks at some of the factual information and some of the policies and so forth, and helps us collectively create a vision beyond, right now, a 3-year plan, but in the past, for so many years, we just lumped along 1 year after the other. Anyways, I would like to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and both in person and watching live stream. I want to invite those of you that are in the room that there's some refreshments in the back if you want to partake. Our next event here in the same room is October 24th. We're asking, going back to what you were saying, but on the other end, we've invited the Dean of the Law School of UBC to come, Catherine DeVerne, to talk about refugee claimants. Within the BC context, very different than what's happening in Quebec and Ontario, but again, not openly discussed. We are seeing historic levels of refugee claimants, some that are walking across the border on a fairly significant level. In fact, over the past 5 years, we're seeing over 320% increase in those refugee claimants coming through irregular means. So Dr. DeVerne from the UBC Law School will be talking about that. And then our last session is on the 14th of November, where Cheryl Curl from the Angus Reid, I've asked her to do a retroactive piece as a result of the outcome of the election, which we don't know yet. What role did immigration play in that? And through the polling that they're doing now, as you mentioned. And over the course of now the debate and the election itself, to come back in this room in person or through live stream to better understand the impact that immigration had on the outcome of the next federal election. So again, thank you all very much. And if you're interested in registering for the next session, please go to ISSBC.org/closer look to register. So thank you very much.